Landlords who were confused by the complicated Oregon eviction protections and rental assistance program got screwed over by a drug-using tenant who didn't pay rent. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's one of those personal stories of a small landlord who had to deal with a crappy tenant during the whole eviction moratorium nonsense, and just trying to get this tenant out of their property. They just ended up in a horrible financial situation with their property torn completely apart, and the tenant just used and abused them. Meanwhile, the state of Oregon didn't do anything to help them, and it's a horrible situation. I absolutely hate reading about this sort of thing, but I have the need to share this sort of thing because there's people out there who don't know what landlords went through because of all the eviction moratoriums and all the nonsense. They thought, hey, the landlords are all these super rich people. They're all doing just fine, even though we weren't getting paid rent, even though we couldn't get these bad tenants out of our properties. And the rules, the regulations that they put in place were so confusing. And, a lot of landlords didn't understand them or even know that what help was available and what they could and couldn't do because the rules were constantly changing. So, it was so frustrating. And, I'm sitting here, I'm reading about stuff that's happening all over the country, and it's still confusing to me, okay? So imagine landlords who don't read as many articles and don't, know as much as I do, how confused they could be. Okay? Now, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know about you. Were you confused by all of the different, rules and regulations and, all the different stuff about the eviction moratoriums when it was going on? I mean, there were state, local moratoriums, there were federal moratoriums, there were, so many different programs of rental assistance and all this stuff. And unless you had like a huge guidebook, it was darn near impossible to figure out exactly what you needed to do and exactly what was going on. And it doesn't help that when you went out and you reached out to the bureaucracy to try to, get some answers, they didn't know what was going on in a lot of cases either, or they were all working from home, or they just completely shut courts down in some cases, and there was nothing that a landlord could do. So, I don't blame these landlords for not knowing what exactly was going on and what exactly was happening in their state because, it's a mess. The whole thing was a mess. It should have never been in place in the first place, and this is the result, okay? Now, this article, it's coming from WCTI12.com, and it says, landlord couple misunderstands law, tenant trashes house during pandemic. Let's see what it says. It took Grants Pass couple 9 months to realize that their destructive tenant wasn't covered under the Oregon eviction moratorium. They eventually evicted him for lease violations, but the damage was already done. David and Tracy Green say the man who lived in their rental property on Drury Lane in Grants Pass had been a normal tenant for 2 years, but then the pandemic hit and he reportedly stopped working. The couple believed the tenant had been using drugs. The rental home, which is next door to theirs, became constantly filled with unwanted guests, and they didn't think they could require anyone to leave due to the eviction moratorium. The law didn't apply to the Greens' tenant, but they didn't know that. So we've got small landlords. They own a property that is right next door to where they live, right? They rent this place out to this tenant. The tenant, loses their job during the eviction moratorium stuff, right? And so they think, they said that we couldn't evict people who were protected, because they lost their job during the pandemic, right? So they just thought, okay, that's cool. We'll just let him stay in there. Unfortunately, he picked up a drug problem and started causing issues. He got people in and out the place day and night, right? Which for some landlords, that's not a big thing. But when you're a small landlord and you live right next door, so suddenly you got a drug house next door. And guess what? You own that drug house. And you can't get rid of this guy. At least you don't think you can. So I can understand why these people were so frustrated, especially with everything they were saying about the eviction moratorium. They probably believed that, hey, there's nothing we can do about this right now. Nobody sleeps. There was always something going on inside, pounding all night. Obsessions over things. They were obsessing over rocks, cutting them open. There were rocks and buckets of things all over the house, said David Green. The Greens attempted to apply for support through Oregon's Landlord Compensation Program, also developed during the pandemic to ease the burden on landlords. The couple said because their tenant never submitted an official declaration of financial hardship, they weren't eligible to receive any money from the fund. However, according to the moratorium law that came into effect January 1st, 2021, tenants cannot claim safe harbor from eviction unless they submit this declaration of financial hardship and show proof to the landlord that they can't pay rent. So yeah, right there you see that the tenant can't pay rent because, they lost their job during the pandemic, but they didn't submit this specific form, right? And so if they don't submit that form, then they can't get the eviction protections. But the landlord doesn't know that. Okay, the landlord thinks, well, I can go ahead and submit the form on my own, and they did, but they weren't eligible because the tenant didn't fill out the form. So they put a landlord in a very hard situation where they say, hey, we're telling you that you can't evict somebody because of financial hardship, but how is the landlord supposed to know that this tenant needed to have this form submitted? Or how was the landlord even supposed to check and see if the tenant submitted the form? Maybe the landlord sent the form to the tenant, told them to submit it, and they didn't. There's so many problems with this law. The landlord should have been able to just apply on their own to get this rental assistance and just gotten it. The tenant shouldn't have been involved at all. Now, I know that opens it up to more possible cases of fraud, etc. But by not allowing that, all that did was made it harder for landlords to actually be able to make money and to survive through this whole pandemic. So that's why, these rental assistance programs were oftentimes, I considered them a joke. I considered them a complete waste. Now, my belief is that there should have never been any sort of eviction moratorium in place at all because it's not constitutional. But I'm not 100% opposed to the rental assistance programs. I'm opposed to the way they were implemented. Okay, where they were tied to this ridiculous eviction moratorium nonsense, where the tenants had more rights to getting that money than the landlords did. And I'm like, hey, the landlords are the ones with the property. They're the ones with the bills being paid. They're the ones who are being forced to house these people for free. So maybe we should cut the tenant out of the process and have only the landlord in there. That's my personal opinion. But anyway, let's keep going. Oregon Law Center's Director of Legislative Advocacy, Sybil Hebb, explained to KTU. The old moratorium and the new moratorium continue to allow landlords to serve notices for lease violations. That has never been included in the protection. Those proceedings may still continue just as they could prior to the passage of the new law. What has changed is the way in which the new state statute deals with no-fault evictions. The Greens, believing that the moratorium applied to their tenant, did not take standard eviction action to remove him until 9 months of destruction had passed. Eventually, the Greens learned of their ability to evict their tenant for lease violations, but 9 months of destruction ravaged their home. Months later, the place, which is their only rental property, is nowhere close to ready to house new tenants. They say they spent thousands of dollars on numerous problems the tenant left behind and have more to come. So yeah, that's confusing. They had multiple different state eviction moratoriums that were in place. They had different rules. The rules changed, and they expect landlords, they expect us to just be able to, oh yeah, we know everything that's going. No, okay? There has to be some sort of leeway so landlords can do their business and still get along with things. Especially, this is a couple with one house, one rental house. They don't have a team of lawyers or even a property manager helping them. They are doing everything on their own, and it is right next door to their own. So when they finally were able to figure it out, they finally were able to file eviction against this person. 9 months have passed, and even if this place's rent was only like $1,000 a month, they're out $9,000 just in lost rent. That doesn't even count the thousands of dollars they spent in repairs to clean up this drug house, right? So up above, it looks like they got a couple of pictures of what this place looks like on the inside, and I'll throw them up over here, and let you see exactly what this place looked like. Because in this picture, there's like crack pipes. I mean, this is ridiculous. Okay, these people, they have a right to have their property. And when states are constantly changing the rules on us, constantly throwing more bureaucracy on us, you know what the end result's going to be? Maybe this couple will just be like, hey, I'm not renting this place out anymore. Okay, you're going to lose this place as a rental property, and it's going to be turned into an owner-occupied home. I'm going to sell it to somebody else, and we're done. We're not going to be landlords anymore. We don't want to help anybody. We don't need to provide affordable housing. We are not a homeless shelter. Okay, we're done. And that's what the end result is, because landlords are going to give up this nonsense, and the only thing that's going to be left is a bunch of people who are looking for housing and can't find it.